Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's full of donuts and coffee. And actually, before we start the next talk, just a quick reminder, please ask the questions via the app. That'd be really good. There's lots of people in here, probably lots of questions. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. The next speaker is Sam. He's from Canberra, where he leads Ubi's cyber practice. Sam has been elbows deep in Microsoft 365 and before that Office 365, before it even came out and was released in Australia. So please welcome Sam.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out to hear what we discovered the hard way about Microsoft 365, so hopefully you don't make the same mistakes we did. All right, so who am I? My name is Sam Brazier-Hollins, and I'm the head of cyber with Ubi. I'm based out of Canberra. This is actually my first time at AUSCERT, so it's been a great experience so far, so hopefully it'll carry on through. But I have presented before at a couple of the ACS CyberCons, and more recently at Gartner as well. I've been in cybersecurity for about 10 years now, and most of that time with Ubi as well. Before that, a bit of time in the defense industry, mostly around systems engineering. And my primary focus is around regulated industries. So that's government, that's critical infrastructure, and the finance sector, all those that really care about their security and have big impacts if it's to go wrong. In my spare time as well, look, I'm from Canberra, so I go into the snow a bit, like a bit of food and drink. And my weird fun fact is I compete competitively in dog sports, which is what you can see there. All right, so why am I speaking to you today? So look, we had a kind of embarrassing incident that happened to us a while ago, and it's not something I'd normally talk about, but in the interest of paying it forward, I wanted to come and share it with you all, so hopefully you don't go through the same thing that we did. And what it was is we locked ourselves out of a client's tenant. So we'd been engaged to build and configure a new M365, or what was then Azure AD, now Entra ID tenant, up to what's a protected government standard. We'd been issued the tenant, which started off, and very quickly we ran into trouble, and pretty much exactly what you see there is what happened to us. We entirely locked ourselves out, which is not a good scenario to be in. If you've been in it before, it is rather problematic to get back in, which is a good thing. But look, you don't want to be in there. So look, I'm going to take you through how we managed it in the first place, and then how not to get into that situation, plus some other tricks and tips from that. And look, it's not just us that this has happened to. You can see if you go onto Reddit, there's a whole lot of people that have this scenario as well. It's never a good time. It gets pretty upsetting, so hopefully you can benefit from it. And look, before we go any further, please feel free to take photos as we go over any of the slides. I'll also be hanging out afterwards. If you come and see me, more than happy to send you a copy of the deck as well and answer any questions if we run out of time. Look, the plan for today, I'm going to first go through that story of how we locked ourselves out and how to avoid that. And then I'm going to take you through some things we've learned from auditing and uplifting Microsoft 365 environments across Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. So we're going to talk about things that are on by default that probably shouldn't be. So these are things that Microsoft helpfully or otherwise enable for any new tenant. A lot of these things are probably not what you want if you're trying to secure your tenant accurately. So they're things we recommend turning off. Likewise, we're then going to talk about some of the things that are off by default that if you're licensed for them, you really should turn on to get that full benefit and realize that ROI out of your investment. We're then going to move into how authentication really works, and this is primarily around conditional access and MFA. Almost every time we've ever done an audit, we've found challenges in conditional access. It hasn't worked the way the client has expected it to work, and in some cases quite disastrously. So we're going to talk through that. And finally, at the end, we're just going to have a little bit about where your data actually lives. Is it all actually in Australia, or is it a little bit more spread around than you think? How to check that, and what to do about it if it's not where you want it to be. All right, so starting off how not to lock yourself out. So how did we get in this mess in the first place? So as I told you before, we were building a new tenant from scratch. And the way we do that in our environment is normally to start with a whole lot of automation. So a whole lot of custom scripts we've created to make things go quickly. And we trusted that automation would work, which is the first problem. We also trusted that Microsoft hadn't changed anything since we'd last tested that automation. And anyone that's worked in Microsoft 365, worked in Azure will know Microsoft is constantly changing things. Some are obvious, like changing the console names every couple of months. They're pretty obvious, you can follow those. But some are much more subtle, and that's what caught us out. And we'll dive into exactly what that is in a minute. We did things in the wrong order as well. There's certain things you're always told, oh, do this first, do this after that, follow a process. And look, we got a bit excited. We took some things out of the wrong order, didn't really think it through, and that made the situation worse. And then finally, we hadn't paid attention to some of the little things right at the start, and because of that, when we really needed that information, we didn't have it, and it made it a problem. All right, so let's go into the specific example. So the automation in question was to create a conditional access policy, and that's within the Entra ID service. So hopefully you're familiar with what this is. In this case, we're trying to create a policy to block authentication from countries that aren't allowed. So pretty simple, and you can see the automation mostly worked, and that's what's on screen here. It's gone through, it's named it, it's assigned it to all users with a couple of exceptions, which were our break glass accounts. That didn't quite go as intended, but we'll come to that in a minute. It's applied to all apps. It's got that single condition, which is all countries and the exclusion of allowed countries. And then based on that to then block all access. Unfortunately though, you see that bit where it says allowed countries? That's what went wrong. The automation broke there. It created that group and didn't populate it. So in effect, we've created a policy that blocks authentication from all countries because there's nothing in that exclusion list. So you can see where we've run into trouble. But look, that's all right. Break glass accounts, also known as emergency access accounts, that's exactly what these are for, right? They're excluded from conditional access, as you saw. That means you can log in when you get stuck, undo the misconfiguration you've made, and you're good to go again. And look, as you saw, the automation's even created those, so that's great. But no one knew what the passwords were. When we created them, no one had stored them in KeyPass or anywhere else. And look, on that note, I wouldn't recommend storing them in KeyPass because if it's in your own tenant and then you lock yourself out, you can't get access to that password to get yourself back in. So that's another trick that catches you out. But look, the accounts have been created. Everyone had thought, oh, we'll fix that at the end. We're gonna have to reset them before we hand over the tenant to the client, so don't bother writing them down. So when we needed them, we didn't have them. All right, so now what do we do? We need to call Microsoft support. And look, they were pretty helpful. We have our partner account. We called them up and said, look, we've locked ourselves out. Here's the deal. Can you let us back in? And they said, yep, that's no problem. We just need to confirm some little details about the tenant with you. And that was specifically the billing contact, which we didn't know. So at this point, we're in a really bad situation. So we've had to call the client. We've had to fess up that we've locked ourselves out. Hey, we know you've created this tenant for us. Can you tell us who the billing contact is? We need them to verify. But the client didn't know either because their procurement team had created that. So long story short, about 2 weeks later, we got the details we needed and we got back in. But look, that's not a good scenario. It was embarrassing, cost time and money. And if that is your production environment, that could be a massive outage. In this case, it was a new development environment we were building. Didn't really matter, it just blew out the schedule a little bit. But if that was your production and you've locked your entire user base out, that's a really bad time. So look, how do you make sure this isn't going to happen to you? I'd recommend 3 things. So look, firstly, Microsoft, as you know, is constantly changing things, which means any automation you have needs to be constantly updated as well. So that means if it worked last month, doesn't mean it's going to work this month. You need to check. And also validate your output. And don't just do a quick validation like we showed, open the policy. Actually go and check things. If it's something really critical, like conditional access, that is going to potentially lock you out, spend that extra 2 minutes, open that up, and make sure it's all worked the way you want to. I'm not saying don't use automation. We strongly, strongly recommend it, and we still use it across all our environments that we maintain, build, and manage, but you've just got to keep a close eye on it and verify that output. Secondly, look, break glass accounts are often an afterthought. They're often things that are done at the end people don't pay attention to, but they are absolutely useless if you can't access them when you need them. As we said, in this case, it wasn't time critical, but if this was production, that would have been an absolute disaster. So make sure you know where those credentials are. Like we said, don't store them in the system itself, because then you can't get them. Put them somewhere else. Even if you have to write them down, put them in an envelope, put them in the safe, just make sure you've got them somewhere so when you need them, they're actually there. And look, because tenants are often set up before we even get to the IT team, they're set up over criminal billing, make sure you've got those relationships with those teams, understand them, and capture this information. When you're doing onboarding, make sure you write this down and store it somewhere secure, so when you need it, you've got it. There's nothing worse than needing it 6, 12 months' time, finding out that that billing contact's no longer with the organization, their email doesn't work, and then you're really in trouble. So it's just simple things. It'll take you 5, 10 minutes, a couple of emails now, but could save you days or even weeks if the worst was to happen. All right, so things that are on by default. There's a lot of things that are on by default in all Microsoft 365 tenants. A lot of them are good, but there are some things we'd recommend turning off. I'm not going to go through all of them today because that'd be a whole other presentation in itself, but I'm going to focus on some specifically that are in the Entra ID, what was formerly Azure AD service, because it's a service that all of you will use no matter what Microsoft 365 or Azure services you're using. You have to use Entra ID to some level, so these settings will apply to all of you here. So we're going to start with the Entra ID default user role permissions. We're going to talk about guest and external user access because look, collaboration is what so many people are using the cloud for in the first place, but most people don't really get how that works. And finally, we're going to talk about social media integrations. And look, this is something every time we audit an organization, especially in government, we'll be told absolutely we've turned off social media integrations. It's off everywhere. We've got this. In about 80% of those times, they're completely wrong and they've got at least one social media integration on. It's not because they're doing a bad job, it's because they're in so many different places and Microsoft loves turning them on by default. So we're going to go through where a couple of those are hiding so you can catch them. All right, so Entra ID default user role permissions. So as the name suggests, these are permissions that apply by default to your users within Entra ID. And there's two specifically that are on by default. They're right at the top of the screen here. So if you go to your Entra ID and you go user settings, these are the first things you'll see. The screenshot here is what it should look like if you've configured it correctly, not what it looks like by default, in case you want to know. So the two we want to turn off are users that can register applications and users that can create security groups. I'm going to talk to why that is, because some of this is self-explanatory, but some of you might be wondering why that is and why we're going against Microsoft's default. So users registering applications. For those who don't understand the setting, at a short, really high-level version, it's around being able to register an app to Microsoft Entra ID. So it could be first party, third party, it could be something you've created, it could be anything. The problem is, if you allow users to do that, it's effectively a form of shadow IT. It means your users can go and provision things that IT team, your SecOps team, your security governance team aren't aware of. And this has been a great vector used recently for Microsoft 365 account takeovers. You send a user a phishing email, you say, hey, click this link, here's this cool new feature, or we're moving to this new timesheet platform, or here's a new way we're sharing files. Like, click on that. They're used to it. It single signs on to Azure because that's what we've already set up. They go register, and boom, you've got a way into that environment. If you don't believe me, just Google it. There's a whole lot of great write-ups on it. And again, there's probably going to be some good conference presentations on this later in the year. But look, you really want to turn that one off. Secondly, users creating security groups. Look, it's in the name. Security groups are for configuring security access. They're for rights, roles, and permissions across your users. It is something your security or identity team should be managing. It's not something you want your standard users to do. They're not there to do that. They're there to use the system, not maintain it. So I'm yet to see any good reason why standard users should be creating those groups. If they do, they're going to add whoever to it. Your separation of duties, your principles of least privilege, all that's going to go out the window, and you're going to have a mess you're going to have to clean up. So really, they're two things, really simple, two toggles, hit save, and you've already improved your environment. All right, next up, if we scroll slightly further down that same page, we're going to get to the guest and external access settings. And look, this is all about guesting and collaboration, which are good things and what most people that use the cloud want to get out of it. We've got to have a think about, what do you want guests to do? So by default, guests have a whole range of access that they probably don't need. They can look at other users' account profiles, they can look at properties, they can look at memberships. Why do they need that? In most organizations we work with, guests are there because you want to share a file to someone, or you want them to collaborate on something, or join a team, do something that's a productivity thing. They don't need to see what groups I'm a member of. They don't need to see information about me or anyone else in the environment. Why would they? So again, what we recommend is to change that to the most restrictive setting. They can still see their properties, so if they've been misconfigured, they can notify someone. They can see their group memberships, so they can see if they've been provisioned what they need, but they don't need to see what I've got, they don't need to see what you've got, so just keep that limited. And it's going back to the simple principles that have all been taught for years, principle of least privilege. If they don't need it, don't let them see it. And look, if you scroll further down that page again, you'll see this other link, Manage External Collaboration Settings. So let's follow the breadcrumbs and see what's there. So here we have the guest invite settings. And again, there's a whole lot of options here. By default, it's a bit more loose than we'd recommend, and you can allow anyone to invite other people, invite guests into your tenant. So look, simple question here is, do you want guests or not? If you want guests, then follow the image and select the second from the bottom. But if you don't want guests, if your tenant is not for that purpose, if your tenant's only for your users, and your way of onboarding is if you're working with a partner, a contractor, a consultant, you onboard them into your tenant, then you have no need for guests. So just turn them off. Don't leave it on for someone to potentially misconfigure and use. Just turn off. If you ever need to turn it back on, simple dialog box. But if you're not using them, select that last option. But look, if you are allowing guests, you've got a couple of options again on how to configure them. And again, we're recommending the strongest, which is allow listing. And that's by domain. So if you're in government, for example, you might say, we'll allow guests from other government organizations. So we might go star.gov.au. If you're in the education sector, you might do the same, star.edu.au. But you're not just allowing everyone. You're not allowing anyone with a Hotmail address or a Yahoo address, if they still exist, to get in and do that sort of thing. You're controlling who you're collaborating with. So it might be your trusted partners, could be contractors, could be consultants again, but you should know what the domain is and control that. And look, allow listing beats blacklisting every day, and I don't need to tell you why. Cool, so social media integration. I'm going to talk about LinkedIn specifically. There's a whole lot of different social media integration options within Microsoft 365. I'm going to talk about LinkedIn because it's on by default. At least that's true in Australia. So if you have US government Azure, or if you're in France or Germany, so 2 EU countries that are very focused on privacy, LinkedIn integration is actually off by default for all users. But in Australia, we don't get it. We get it on by default. And that's because Microsoft owns LinkedIn. They want you to use it. And it allows users to connect their work and school accounts with LinkedIn. So that's linking together their work account, so their Microsoft account, with potentially their personal accounts that they're using for LinkedIn, which can lead to all sorts of trouble. Great for social engineering. There's a great article on ABC News from the Director General of ASIO talking about how social engineering is being used against large corporates and government using information like LinkedIn to do that. So you don't want to make it easy for people. Look, I am yet to ever encounter a single client that is actually using this for a business purpose. If that is one of you, I'd love to hear from you afterwards. But as I've said, after many years of doing this, not one person has ever been able to provide a business justification for why this setting should be on. So look, we recommend turning it off. Real simple, one click, hit save, it's off. If you do need it for some special users, you can select that group, put them in a group and manage it. But again, yet to see a use case for that. If that's you, please let me know. But that's not the only place LinkedIn is hiding. So we've got to find it somewhere else. And we're going to go to a completely different portal this time. It's actually buried 5 levels deep. So this one is often on and people don't see it. So we're going to go to the Exchange Admin Center. We're going to go to Roles, Outlook Web Access Policy, so OWA policies. You've got to pick each of your policy names if you've got multiple of them, and then go to Manage Features. You'll see it's in that red box, LinkedIn Contact Sync. And again, you probably want to turn this off. Look, while you're there, you can see that box above. Hopefully it's already off for you. But if not, that Exchange Active Sync, you really, really want to turn that off. We're going to come back to that later. So if you're wondering why that is, just keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll come to that soon. All right, so things that are off by default. Look, there's many reasons that Microsoft will tell you that there's things that are off by default in the tenants, and lots of them for good reasons. Some will break things if you turn them on, or have the potential to break things, and that's a good reason for something to be off by default. Some are advanced features that Microsoft don't recommend you turn on without an understanding of them and some extra configuration. Again, that makes sense. But there's also some settings that Microsoft has simply changed their mind over time. They were on by default 2 years ago that are now off by default, or vice versa. A classic example of this, it's not Microsoft 365 related, but it is relevant, is macros in Office. They were on by default, Microsoft turned them off, there was backlash, they got turned back on, they're now going through the process of turning them back off again. So look, it's something we're going to see. It's going to continue to happen across the cloud as well, so it's something you need to pay attention with. And just because something was set up the right way the first day, doesn't mean it'll be set up if you create another tenant now. We see this a lot where we have clients that build secondary or tertiary tenants for things like dev and test. They assume that their default settings will be the same between those that they've created years after each other. Definitely not the case, and you need to check. So I'm going to go through an example of something that's off by default that we really recommend turning on. And it is the automated remediation feature of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. If you're not familiar with what that is, I've gone and asked Copilot to tell us what it is. Fortunately, it gave me a really long answer, way too wordy, so I asked it to summarize. And really, it comes down to, it's a feature that will automatically identify threats where you've got the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint agent enabled and can take automated remediation. So it can stop that threat without your security operations team needing to hit go or hit approve. So for the example is, if it sees malware, it can just go and kill it. If it sees something spreading through your environment, it can shut it down. It's not waiting for that. So that sounds cool. So why is it not on by default? Well, could it break things? Well, yes. Anything with automation, we've heard about it over the last couple of days. There's a lot of risk and reward with automation. And look, I've asked Copilot again, what are the risks? And the big one is false positives. It could see something, you might have a legitimate service, a legitimate application that for whatever reason, Defender for Endpoint thinks is malicious and it kills. But look, that's not that big deal, right? If it just blocks a user, if something happens, they can call the service desk, you can override it. It's pretty quick to add that exclusion. It's not the end of the world. And we're to argue that the risk is definitely worth the reward. So I'll give you the flip side of that. Imagine it's Friday afternoon, the SecOps team have gone home for the weekend, they've gone down to the pub, they've got one user left in the office, they get a weird email, this weird PDF, they double click on it, oh, that didn't work, oh, that's a Monday problem. Lock their computer, walk off. Look, that's a classic malware dropper scenario. You get some ransomware on the machine and it starts doing things. A couple of milliseconds later, Defender for Endpoint's like, I recognize this is malware, this looks like a ransomware, do you want me to kill it? It sends that message to the security operations team, but none of them are there. So it's sitting there waiting for that response to say, yes, I can take action, I can isolate that machine, I can kill that process, I can take the response. But no one answers it. So by the time the team comes back on Monday, that's spread through an environment and you've got a really bad time. And that actually happened to a client we know, this exact scenario. Defender had identified the threat, but wasn't authorized to take action, and by the time the team got to deal with it, it had spread and caused significant impacts. So we'd say, yes, that is worth turning on. Is it an advanced feature? Well, yes, it obviously is by its nature. And look, a fun fact on that as well, the old name for Defender for Endpoint, again, we've talked about Microsoft loves changing things, was Defender Advanced Threat Protection. So we'll tick that box, it's an advanced feature. And look, has Microsoft changed its mind about this setting? Well, yes, it has. Back in the day, so this is August 2020, so quite a while ago in this field, this setting was set to semi-autonomous. What that meant is it would automatically detect threats, as you'd expect, but it wouldn't take action. It would send you a notification and rely on your security operations team to hit go. So that has now changed. For any tenants created post that date, it's now set to full automation, which means it will take that action. But there's still a lot of you that will have set up this capability before August 2020, so this won't be on. It will just be sitting there. It'll look like it's on, but it's waiting for you to take action. So what do you want to do about it? If you want to turn it on, how do you do it? We're going to go to another console, because again, you've always got to go to another console. This is the Microsoft Defender one, which is security.microsoft.com. You go to settings, you go to endpoints, you go to auto remediation, and you go to device groups. If you have no custom device groups, you'll get what's on screen, the ungrouped devices in brackets default. For that, if you're an older tenant, it will be semi. If you're a new tenant, it will be full. We'd recommend swapping that to full. If you have different device groups, you'll have to go through and do this for each device group. And look, if you are really concerned, if you have some specialist workloads, if you've got this deployed to certain servers that cannot go down no matter what, you may choose to leave it on semi or even turn this feature off because you're worried about the risk of it taking it down. But across at least your endpoint fleet, we really strongly recommend putting in full automation and taking that. Worst case scenario, it knocks the device off the network, a user needs to call the service desk, not the end of the world, but it could save you a world of hurt. All right, so some other things are off by default. I'm going to talk about two other Defender features. These are both licensed if you have Microsoft 365 E5, if you're enterprise, or if you're in education, it's the A5 suite. Either way, you'll still have them. It's the SafeDocs capability in Defender for Office 365, which was previously Office ATP. And the other one is the Enforce App Access in Defender for Cloud Apps. This is the product that was formerly called MCAS, or Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is Microsoft's CASB provider. I know there was a lot of acronyms, but don't blame me. Oh, look, so we'll go into SafeDocs first. So we're going to go back to that security.microsoft.com. We're not going to go to settings this time, though. We're going to go to policies. We're then going to go through, find the specific policies under safe attachments, and then we're going to select global settings. SafeDocs lives under safe attachments. The first option should be enabled by default, but it's always good to check, making sure it's actually turned on across your entire suite. So again, across OneDrive, across Teams, across SharePoint, make sure that's on. Should be on by default, but good to check. And then the next one's the one you want to turn on. You want to turn on SafeDocs. So what SafeDocs is additional protection for any of your Microsoft Office documents. We all know that Microsoft Office documents are another great way to bring malware into the environment, especially if you've got VBA macros embedded there. Great way to bring things in, great way to turn off Defender and do all sorts of other fun things. So let's put some extra protections in place. So we recommend turning on that SafeDocs, hitting save, and it's just that extra layer. If you've got any of those malicious documents in your environment, at least you've got a chance of stopping them. And then over in MCAS, or Defender for Cloud Apps, but now we're going to go back to settings. We're going to select Cloud Apps, and you can follow it through. You've got that top option to tick. I don't have a red box for some reason. So that's enforcing app access. This is an interesting one because this is really misunderstood. So a lot of people will use MCAS, now Defender for Cloud Apps, to go through and sanction or unsanction applications. So the most common use case for this is going through and blocking or attempting to block access to things like Dropbox and Box and unapproved file sharing things that you don't want your data to go to because that's an example of a data spill. So it's a good way of enforcing your DLP policies to basically say if it's unsanctioned, don't allow people to go. What we've often seen is people go through that, spend a whole lot of time reviewing those sites, unsanctioning them all. The next day, they review their logs, and they're still seeing users accessing them, and they don't know what's going on. It's because you need to tick this box. This is the box that's enforcing Defender for Endpoint, which is what's running on all your endpoints, to actually take this policy and apply it at the endpoint to block access to those URLs. So then it doesn't mean if you're sitting behind your corporate firewall, doesn't mean if you're behind a SIG, doesn't mean if you're working from home or you're in the Qantas lounge or you're at a conference, because that endpoint protection is what's enforcing that filtering, it will block your users being able to go to those sites and therefore stop them being able to upload that material. So another great one to turn on. All right, how authentication really works. So if you have no conditional access, you are not secure by default. It is a free-for-all. Conditional access is there to control authentication. It provides the capability to secure and control sessions and authentication, but it is not secure by default. If there's nothing in there, you can do what you like. Often people say, oh, it's like a firewall for identity. I strongly disagree with this view. Because when we think of firewalls, at least most people that have been in the industry, you think a firewall should be configured that at the end of the day, it's got a default deny or block anything that doesn't match. But that's not how conditional access works. It evaluates the rules based on your user, where you're authenticating from, how you're authenticating, and if it finds a policy, it'll match it and take that action. If it doesn't match any, it'll allow you in. So it's a really different way of thinking, and that's why we don't like thinking about it as a firewall, because it gets us in that wrong mindset. And look, there's cool new features. Look, Microsoft are very aware that people are challenged by conditional access. It is complex. So they've recently introduced Microsoft managed policies. So what they're doing, there's a quote from Microsoft directly there, they've got 3 policies that they're now deploying if their data tells them that it would make your organization more secure. So it's a nice way of saying, if Microsoft thinks you're missing something that's pretty basic for authentication, they will automatically give you a conditional access policy. And look, I think that's actually a good thing, because anything that improves our security is positive. To tell if you've got this, you go into Enter ID, you go to conditional access policies, and you can see in the middle there's little 1 with what looks like a little award. It's not really an award, it's kind of saying you've done the wrong thing, but look, let's take the positive spin on that. And look, it shows up there at the bottom. You can see it's tagged as Microsoft Managed, and it's got an alert next to it. So Microsoft Managed policies, they are a great thing, but you've got to be a bit careful with them. They'll be automatically enabled after 90 days if you don't do something about it first. So if you see this in your environment, don't just leave them and think, oh, that's fine, it's report only, it will sort itself out. It will turn itself on. And if it's not doing what you want, if for whatever reason you've specifically not configured that control, you could be in a lot of trouble. So please review them and either turn them on if you need them or create your own custom policy that does the same thing. Or if you don't want them there for a specific reason, add your exclusions or disable them. And look, if nothing else, go and add your break glass exclusions. We've already talked about how important those can be. They will not be added by default. Microsoft recommends deep in the documentation that you do this. No one ever reads that documentation, but you need to go in there, exclude your break glass accounts, otherwise you might be back to square one. Cool. But you need more than just Microsoft managed policies. They only have 3 at present, and I've put them up here. Look, they are confusingly named. This is a copy paste. I know they say multi-factor authentication in some of them multiple times. Again, direct any feedback to Microsoft. But look, they're there to basically, it boils down to enforcing MFA if you're an admin accessing a Microsoft admin portal. I think we can all agree that's a good thing, no worries. Multi-factor authentication for per user multi-factor authentication users. It's a mouthful, but what that basically means is if you're enabled for multi-factor authentication, then you should be forced to do multi-factor authentication. Great. And finally, multi-factor authentication to force re-authentication for risky sign-ins. So that's if the service formerly known as Azure AD Identity Protection, now Enter ID Protection, detects that it's a risky sign-in. So this can be things like impossible travel, first time signing in from a new country or new device. It will do an MFA check just to enforce, even if that's not normally required, just to check that that sign-in is actually coming from a legitimate user. And look, that's good, but that's not the whole story. So don't just rely on Microsoft policies. We know we've had a client that says, oh, now they're doing this, we don't need to do conditional access, they'll do it for us. Absolutely not. That is not where you want to be. And this is why. So if you go again into that deep Microsoft documentation, a couple of layers down below Microsoft managed policies, there's something called block legacy authentication. So I'm going to talk through legacy authentication because, again, it's something that's really misunderstood, but really, really important. So I like this. If you go to Google and you type in Microsoft Legacy Authentication to find out what it is, the first hit is from Microsoft themselves telling you to block legacy authentication. And that actually goes back to that link we had before. And it's really important. So, legacy authentication. It's also known as basic authentication, and that's a good name for it. It's authentication protocols that don't support MFA. So they either predate the implementation of MFA or for whatever specific reason they just don't support it. So we're talking about things like authenticated SMTP, IMAP, POP, all those things we'll have remembered from years ago that hopefully no one's using anymore, although still most agencies we audit will still have something like authenticated SMTP enabled, which is something to be concerned about. But look, the reason you don't want this on is it effectively gives attackers a way to bypass MFA, attack your environment, and attempt to get account takeover. We see it's really commonly done. There's stats from Microsoft that over 90% of successful attacks against Azure AD or now Enter ID accounts are using legacy authentication protocols because it just takes MFA out of the way. So you can just go back to your classic password spray, your credential stuffing, your stolen credentials to get in. And once they're in, we all know attackers can move laterally. They can elevate their privileges, so you don't want that. And there's not not really any good excuse to have this on anymore. The only example we can really think about is if you still have authenticated SMTP in your environment, but if so, it should be for a single user for a specific purpose. It should not be across the board, so you need to lock it down. So how do you do that? Look, the best way of doing it is with a conditional access policy. This is a copy from what was originally the DTA Protected Utility Blueprint, now managed by ASD and the ACSC. This was a blueprint that was written initially for federal government, but applies to all of Australian industry. It's how to manage and secure Microsoft 365 to a good standard. So you can still collaborate, you can still get those benefits, but it is secure. Look, I think it's a great resource, highly recommend going and using it. I'm a bit biased though, because I was one of the original authors and have maintained it over the last few years, but it is a great source. And this is where you can get the details of this policy and the rest of the conditional access policies that are recommended. But look, if you're going to create a conditional access policy, some simple things, give it a simple name. Give it a name that you can understand, that anyone else who looks at the environment can understand. So when you bring an auditor in, they can read it and see what it is. Is it an allow policy or a grant policy, or is it a block policy? Pretty simple, use that name and call out what it's for. So in this case, we want to block legacy authentication, so let's call it that. In this case, we're going to apply it to everyone, and we go back against what I said earlier. We're not going to exclude our break glass accounts from this policy because they shouldn't be using it. And we definitely don't want our break glass accounts, those ones that hold the keys to the kingdom, to be excluded and be able to bypass MFA. So we really want to make sure this is everyone applies to it, no legacy authentication. As we said, if you are using it for some specific users, then you can add them, but that should be a short-term thing while you migrate to a newer platform. And then simple rules, you're going to conditions, you're going to the client apps, you're unticking the 2 modern ones, so that's anything that does support MFA, you're ticking those 2, and look, there's that Exchange Active Sync. I told you we'd see it again. It is a legacy authentication protocol. That's why you want to turn it off. You want to make sure it's not anywhere in your environment, so that's why we unticked it earlier. Here we're going to tick it to block it, we hit save, and then we've blocked legacy authentication. If you're not sure if this is going to work for you or not, put the policy in audit mode, give it a month, see what comes back. If there is anything, go and talk to those users, suss out what's going on. It might mean that you've got a really old install of Microsoft Office somewhere that you need to update. If so, you've probably got other problems, but it's a good way of finding it and going to deal with it. But really, you want to be turning this off. All right, so I think we're doing all right for time. So the last part, where your data actually is. And look, whenever we audit someone, they'll always say, oh, it's in Australia, we know where it is, we've got this covered. Fortunately, that's often not the case. If you want to check, we're going to have to go to another portal again. This time it's the Microsoft 365 admin portal, so that's admin.microsoft.com. You go to settings, organizational policy, data location, so another 4 layers deep, which is why people don't often find it. And if everything's going well, it should look like this. So you'll see those 4 services that actually hold your corporate data. So that's Exchange Online, Microsoft Teams, OneDrive, and SharePoint Online. They should all say Australia. You'll see EOP and Viva will still say Asia Pacific. Don't worry about those, they're not available in Australia yet, but they're not really holding your corporate data, so that's fine. But that's what it should look like. If that's the case, great. You'll see there's some wording down the bottom about advanced data residency. That's another service Microsoft offers to help you migrate data if it's not in the right place or to force it to be in a certain location. But unfortunately, a lot of people's teams is not in Australia. Not that anyone's fault, but this is something we see more often than not in audit. And the problem is, if you were an early adopter and you turned on Microsoft 365 or Office 365 in the early days, you would have seen a disclaimer that Office 365 was available in Australia. Caveat. And that caveat was Microsoft Teams was not available in Australia on day 1 when Office 365 launched. So while your other services would be homed in Australia, Office or Microsoft Teams would end up being homed in Asia Pacific, which is not Australia. It can often be places like Singapore or Hong Kong, but key, not in Australia. And that's caught out a lot of people because they've assumed that if Office 365 is there, everything's there, and that's not the case. So this is why we really recommend going to check. It's really awkward when someone has told us in initial engagement, 100% of our data's in Australia, we've checked this, we're sovereign, and then you go and find, well, actually you're not quite as sovereign as you think. So that's what that text is all telling you about, that if it was old, you might be in the wrong spot. What should have happened is Microsoft reps should have reached out to you if you were one of these people. They should have told you you weren't in Australia, and they should have helped you move for free. But that does not always happen. We've definitely had a number of clients that missed that email, didn't get that comms from the rep. So if that's you, reach out to your Microsoft account rep, ask them why you didn't know, and ask for some help. But there's a good chance they're going to try and sting you for that advanced data residency. But look, if data sovereignty is important to you, this is one to keep an eye on. And look, finally, as a bonus, Defender for Endpoint, we talked about that earlier. Until recently, it was only available in the US, the UK, and EU. If you went and configured it through that security.microsoft.com initially, you got a drop down and you could pick your location. But if you didn't, and you just configured it through the Azure portal, say you're using Azure Security Centers, it used to be called, or Defender for Server, it would automatically select EU, which wasn't helpful and not great for our region. Look, it's now available in Australia. It is a bit of a pain to migrate though. It's not a simple just one-click go. You effectively have to offboard all your current devices from your existing instance, have a new one created and onboard them to that. You can't actually migrate your data directly. If you're sending your logs to something like Sentinel, that can be the mitigation for that. But it is a little nuanced. So again, this is something we'd recommend reaching out to your local Microsoft account rep or support rep, have a chat to them. But again, now it's available in Australia. It is good to move over. Cool, so in summary, to wrap up, because I know I'm going to get the move on in a minute, 5 things, if nothing else you've taken away from today, please remember, get your break glass accounts in order. If you don't, you'll need them at some point, they won't work, and you're going to be in trouble. So please sort those out. It'll take you 5 minutes when you get home, but can save you a world of hurt. There we go. 2, review your user settings in Enter ID. Again, really simple. If you haven't got a photo of those, come see me, get a copy of the slides. Again, 5 minutes, simple things to turn off, won't break anything, but will help prevent something potentially going very wrong in the future. Power up Defender. If you've got that E5 or A5 licensing, you're already paying for it, so you might as well get that value out of it, and there's nothing worse than finding out it could have prevented a threat that kept your team up overnight, that cost you a whole lot of money, so you might as well use what you've got. Look, upgrade your conditional access policies. As we said, use things like the ASD blueprint if you need a guide to how to do it. There's a great tool in the console as well called the what if tool. You can put in scenarios and see what would happen, but there's nothing beats functional testing, but really make sure they're doing what you think they're doing, because your attackers sure as hell are doing what are using them elsewise. And look, finally, nothing else, check your team's data location. It'll take you 5 minutes. Once you've done that, then you're happy you are sovereign. If not, well, again, contact Microsoft. All right, we made it. Thank you all for coming out, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, awesome, mate. Look at the back of the room. There's people standing up. That's how popular it is, and I'm sure they can't read the fine print on the screen from up there. So that was one of the biggest questions we had: is how can people get a copy of your slides? So I know you got cards and stuff like that. So definitely after this, hit up Sam.
Yeah, I'll be hanging out here. If we get moved out of the room, I'll be in the foyer. Just come up and see me. There's another one of my team wearing a similar shirt. Come up and see him if you can't find me, and we'll hook you up with the slides.
Yeah, so much great advice that'll lower your incident response costs. So definitely have a chat. One of the questions was pretty good. How have you set up monitoring on your break glass accounts and service accounts?
Yeah, really good question. Look, it's something I didn't touch on, but absolutely you do want to monitor those, because if it's not you using them, it's someone else using them, could be in a lot of trouble. If you have E5 licensing, we use Defender for Cloud Apps. We create a custom policy to alert on any actions related to those. Within our organization, we send it to our senior security team. They get both an email and an SMS alert. We also send it to a group Teams chat we have, so no matter what service they're on, they'll see it. We have a system so we know if any of us are going to use it, we'll post into that Teams chat beforehand. So say, hey, I need to log on for this reason. Expect it, but if ever we see that alert and no one's posting there, then we know it's someone trying to do something or someone actively using it, and then we can take steps to prevent it. So look, if you don't have that, there's a couple of other alerts you can do in Microsoft if you don't have E5, but look, we've found that to be the most effective and quickest way to get that. If you do have a SIEM, you can use that to send alerts as well, but you don't want to just send them in band, and that's why you use SMS as well, because if someone gets in and can disable those things, depending how quick they are, that's why you want to have something else coming out.
Excellent advice. Another good question about privilege access is, do you know if there's any capabilities to use behavior analysis for privileged access patterns?
So there is a capability in what used to be called Azure ATP. Before that, it was Advanced Threat Analytics on-prem. It's now Defender for Identity. It does user and entity analytics. It's mostly tied at your ADDS or your on-prem domain, but it's a really cool way of seeing that. Again, if you've got Defender for Cloud Apps, there is some behavior analytics policies you can enable. Most of them should be enabled by default, but you may need to adjust what they trigger on depending on what your use space is like. But there's definitely some of those capabilities, and look, we definitely recommend turning those on. Getting that behavior analysis is really good, because it's not just binary of good, bad, but it's that slow build-up of activities that can often trigger something, especially for those malicious insiders.
Excellent. Well, we're so out of time. There's lots of other really good questions here. I know everyone, sort of Office 365 touches everyone, right? So maybe catch Sam up outside. So please thank Sam for a great talk.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam.